Here's a look at the current sea surface temperature anomalies throughout the northern Atlantic, and right now it is very concerning as the sea surface temperatures are nearly record-breaking when it comes to how much above average it is, and that could lead to the hurricane season being more active than what you anticipate that you'd see during an El Nino pattern, which is expected to build this hurricane season. So this will play a big role in terms of the amount of tropical cyclones that will develop. I do expect the hurricane season to fall closer to average rather than below average, which is what we typically see during an El Nino. We see a below average hurricane season, but since the sea surface temperatures are nearly record breaking when it comes to how much above average they are, I expect the hurricane season to fall more closer to average or potentially slightly above average. But we need to take a look at several different factors before we can automatically jump into that conclusion. But right now, the sea surface temperatures anomalies are looking very concerning. Another thing to point out is that the Atlantic, we're in a positive Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, which means that sea surface temperatures will likely be above average, at least compared to the long-term average. The last time we were in a negative Atlantic multidecadal oscillation was back in the early 90s. So for the past around 30 years or so, the sea surface temperatures have mainly been warmer than average, at least compared to a long-term average, thanks to the positive Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. So that will certainly make the hurricane season more active than what you'd see in an El Nino anywhere between, let's say, 1965 to 1995 when we were in negative Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Typically during a positive oscillation, we see that the sea surface temperatures are much warmer than average, while during a negative oscillation, the sea surface temperatures are cooler than average, which means that there's a lot less tropical cyclone activity in the Atlantic. So that's something to keep in mind as well, that will contribute to potentially this hurricane season being more active than usual. So here's an example of the sea surface temperature anomalies during a positive Atlantic multidecadal oscillation versus a negative Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. We see that during a positive phase, we see the sea surface temperatures are much warmer than average, while during a negative phase, the sea surface temperatures are much cooler than average. Since we're in a positive Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, we should expect more tropical cyclone activity, at least compared to the long-term average. Of course, the obvious pattern we need to take a look at is the ENSO outlook, and as you can see, pretty much El Nino phase is guaranteed at this point as we approach the hurricane season, where we do see that during the months of July, August, September, the most active months of hurricane season, we're at a 90% chance we're going to be in an El Nino phase, which will play a major role in terms of the amount of tropical cyclones that will develop, because typically during an El Nino, we see the wind shear a little bit stronger in the Atlantic, as well as a lot more stability over the Atlantic, which prevents as many tropical cyclones to develop. So that definitely will play a role, and that definitely will suppress the amount of tropical cyclones we will experience this hurricane season, at least compared to the prior hurricane seasons, the most recent hurricane seasons, because most recent hurricane seasons, the 2020, 2021, 2022 hurricane season, were all La Nina hurricane seasons. So we saw, for the most part, an above average amount of tropical cyclones, with the exception of last year, 2022, where the amount of tropical cyclones was around average, but we still saw a very powerful hurricane such as Hurricane Ian. But with an El Nino phase, that's less likely to happen, which is certainly good news. But remember, all it takes is just one powerful storm to completely devastate a community. So don't underestimate this hurricane season if, let's say, we see less tropical cyclones than you anticipate, because remember, all it takes is just one storm. But an El Nino pattern should suppress tropical cyclone activity a little bit more this hurricane season. So we clearly see the El Nino effect take place during the Atlantic hurricane season, because the sea surface temperatures over the equatorial Pacific are much warmer than average, which promotes a lot more lift. And of course, that air needs to sink somewhere, and it typically sinks towards the Atlantic, where there's a lot more stability as a result of this sinking air. And since the pressure along in the upper levels of the atmosphere is a lot lower over the Atlantic during an El Nino pattern, all the air that's forced upwards into the upper levels of the atmosphere and over the equatorial Pacific will want to move to where the air pressure along the upper levels is lower, and that typically occurs right over the Atlantic, which creates a strong westerly upper level wind shear, which definitely does prevent tropical cyclone activity, because trade winds along the surface moves from an easterly direction, which goes against the upper level winds during an El Nino pattern, where the winds typically come from a westerly direction. So that creates a strong amount of wind shear over the Atlantic, and that definitely suppresses tropical cyclone activity, and that's what's expected to occur this hurricane season. But but like I said, the much warmer than average sea surf temperatures could even out the stronger wind shear we'd see during an El Nino and create hurricane season that's closer to average or potentially slightly above average when it comes to the amount of tropical cyclone formation. Another key factor we need to take a look at is the climatology models, which pretty much forecast the long-term precipitation anomalies as well as wind shear anomalies. And this is one of the computer models which pretty much takes a consensus of multiple different computer models and pretty much averages it out when it comes to where exactly you want to bring, let's say, more or less precipitation than usual. And we do see that during the most active months of the hurricane season, August, September, and October, we see that the computer models are forecasting much more rainfall than usual right over the main development region just north of the Caribbean islands, and even extending up along the Gulf Stream, which makes me believe that many tropical cyclones will sort of move in this direction and then move potentially closer to up along the East Coast. Now, I'm not surprised by this, because typically during an El Nino, we see, of course, the upper level winds come from a westerly direction at a much stronger speed, which forces tropical cyclones to stay a little bit further eastward thanks to the stronger westerly upper level winds. So I do expect more tropical cyclones to develop a little bit further eastward this hurricane season, thanks to the stability and the strong westerly winds an El Nino would typically bring, especially towards the Western Caribbean as well as the Gulf of Mexico. So the east coast of the United States could be more at risk when it comes to hurricane landfalls, or at least tropical cyclone impacts, since the westerly winds will push tropical cyclones a little bit further eastward this hurricane season. And since we're seeing more precipitation than usual in the main development region, that could be a concern, because of course the main development region is an area that's pretty much infamous for developing the most tropical cyclones. And if we see the precipitation if we see a lot more precipitation than usual over the main development region, that definitely will enhance the risk of increasing the amount of tropical cyclones that develop during the hurricane season. So I do expect that this hurricane season will fall a little bit higher than usual, thanks to the fact that there's going to be more precipitation than average over the main development region, while we'll likely see less tropical cyclones over the Gulf of Mexico and the Southern Caribbean this hurricane season. Another thing we need to take a look at is analog years, and pretty much analog years are years that are very similar to what we're experiencing this season, as they give a good indication of what would happen during the present time frame, when of course we'd be where of course the conditions were very similar. So it's definitely good to compare those years to this one, because it definitely gives a good indication of how the hurricane season will turn out. And The years that stand out the most to me, that look the most similar to what we're going to experience this year, where we're going into an El Nino coming off of 3 consecutive La Niñas, is the 1957 hurricane season as well as the 1976 hurricane season, where both of those hurricane seasons experienced an El Nino right after 3 consecutive La Nina hurricane season. So let's take a look at those hurricane seasons right now. So this is how the 1957 hurricane season looked like. As you can see, of course, we didn't see much tropical cyclones at all, and we did see one hurricane develop, actually 2 hurricanes develop, and we had one that made landfall right around the border of Louisiana and Texas. But overall, a very weak hurricane season. Only 10 storms formed, which is below the long-term average and even below the average of a negative Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. And we do see that more of the tropical cyclones developed a little bit further eastward because, like I said, the stronger westerly upper level winds associated with an El Nino would likely force tropical cyclones to move a little bit further eastward. But we do see that it was a very weak hurricane season, which could maybe give some optimism that this hurricane season will be weak like this. However, we need to keep in mind that this hurricane season occurred during a negative Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. So sea surface temperatures during this hurricane season were more likely than not a lot cooler than average, which definitely suppressed the amount of potential tropical cyclones. And I don't expect that to occur this hurricane season because the sea surface temperatures are not only warmer than average, but almost record-breaking when it comes to how much warmer than average it is. So that's something to pay close attention to. Now let's take a look at the 1976 hurricane season. During the 1976 hurricane season, we did see more tropical cyclones develop. However, a pretty noticeable thing with this hurricane season is that a lot of the tropical cyclones developed east of the Gulf of Mexico, which shows that the El Nino really influenced where tropical cyclones develop, as tropical cyclones develop a little bit further eastward thanks to the stronger westerly winds. And we did see a couple of hurricanes. Many of them did not reach anywhere close to land, with the exception of this tropical cyclone right here, which made landfall in Long Island as a tropical storm and was uncomfortably close to the East Coast as a hurricane. But we do see this hurricane season was weaker than usual as well. Many of these storms you see did not develop into tropical storms. They were just many of them were tropical depressions. So that definitely could also give optimism that this hurricane season will be weaker than usual. But again, keep in mind this occurred during a negative Atlantic multidecadal oscillation where the sea surface temperatures were cooler than average. I don't expect the hurricane season to be this weak either, with sea surface temperatures this warm. So this is my updated hurricane season forecast. So in my previous hurricane season video, which I made around a month ago, I forecasted 14 named storms, 8 hurricanes, as well as 4 major hurricanes. But for this forecast, I'm rising the amount of total storms and hurricanes that will develop just marginally, because I do expect that the warmer than average, because the sea surface temperatures became a lot warmer than what I'd anticipate where they would be at this point. So I do believe that will contribute to slightly more storms than what you typically see in an average hurricane season. And this is a short-term average, so this is primarily including the years where we were in positive Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. So I do expect this hurricane season to be slightly above average. But remember, all it takes is just one major storm, whether it's a weaker hurricane season than usual or a stronger hurricane season. Remember, all it takes is just one storm to completely devastate a community. So don't at all underestimate any tropical cyclone just because this hurricane season might be weaker than you anticipate. And here's my forecast on where exactly I expect the most tropical cyclone formation. So of course, if you're in the red, this is where I'm expecting an above average amount of tropical cyclone formation, as it seems like the computer models are honing in on the main development region, receiving the most precipitation, and the wind shear won't be as strong over that region, even though we're in an El Nino, let's say, compared to what we'd see in the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico, where those areas will be closer to the equatorial Pacific to experience more wind shear. So I do expect more tropical cyclones than usual to develop further eastward in the Atlantic this hurricane season, and the East Coast could be more at risk when it comes to hurricane season landfalls. But for the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, I'm expecting a below average amount of tropical cyclone formations, because the wind shear for an El Nino is typically a lot stronger over those regions, thanks to the close proximity they are to the equatorial Pacific. And I do expect more stability to exist over this area, as the computer models are suggesting as well. So this is my hurricane season forecast for 2023, my updated hurricane season forecast. And thank you guys for watching, and make sure to stay tuned for more hurricane season videos, especially once the hurricane season really gets going. So I'll keep you guys updated very frequently during the hurricane season. But I thank you guys for watching, and make sure to subscribe if you want to see more weather related content.